This is the house in Athens of the German archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann. He died in 1890, exhausted by his passionate and obsessive quest to find truth in the ancient legend of the Trojan War. But he never solved the riddle. Was the search an illusion? Invention of the bards? Had the city never existed at all? Schliemann had begun the search, now others would follow. His assistant, Wilhelm Dorpfeld. The Briton, Arthur Evans. The American, Carl Blegen. As the new science of archaeology attempted to bring to life the Age of the Heroes. Once upon a time, there was a town called Troy. So said the Greek poet Homer, who lived around 700 BC. Troy, he said, was a great and wealthy city which stood near the Dardanelles. On a visit to Greece, the prince of Troy, Paris, eloped with the wife of the king of Sparta, Helen. The Greeks gathered 1,000 ships to take her back. Their leader was Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, rich in gold. After 10 years of war, the city was sacked when it was entered by the famous trick of the wooden horse. That was the story, but was it just a story? At Mycenae in 1876, Heinrich Schliemann set out to prove it. There he found the tombs of rich and powerful Bronze Age kings, literally laden with gold, just as Homer had said. Armed to the teeth with weapons of bronze. At Tiryns, near Mycenae, behind the mighty walls of which Homer had sung, Schliemann uncovered remains of a Bronze Age palace resembling those described by the poet. Here were even wall paintings showing images of people who had lived at the time the war was thought to have taken place, around 1200 BC. But 300 miles across the Aegean Sea, mystery still surrounded Troy itself. Schliemann claimed he had found it at a little hill called Hissarlik in what is now northwestern Turkey. There he had excavated a small prehistoric citadel. But could this tiny place, only 100 yards across, really have been the splendid city of Homer's story? Schliemann's proof, the so-called jewels of Helen with which he had bedecked his Greek wife, was soon shown to be 1,000 years too early. The search, however, continued, and back home in Manchester, my search now turned to Schliemann's loyal assistant, the architect Wilhelm Dorpfeld, the man who was determined to take up Schliemann's torch and prove the doubters wrong. I've called archaeology the most romantic of sciences because it attempts to bring back lost time, and that's especially evident in this most romantic of stories. And it's true, above all, of the second great figure in our search, Dorpfeld, because if anything, he was a greater romantic than Heinrich Schliemann himself. He spent much of his later life, and he lived to be nearly 90, living on the Greek island of Levkas, attempting to prove that it was the true Ithaca of Homer's Odyssey, the home of King Odysseus, and in fact he's buried there. So like Schliemann, he remained a lover of Greece to the end. He, as he put it himself, was inspired by the master, Schliemann, and it was he who would endeavour to bring Schliemann's unfulfilled dreams to reality, to prove the truth of Homer's vision of Troy. What the two of them shared was the same driving imagination, and the difference, perhaps, as Dorpfeld himself admitted, was sheer luck. For Schliemann, even in his childhood dreams, could hardly have dared imagine what Dorpfeld would now find. The site of Hissarlik, we now know, was extraordinarily complicated, with 9 cities superimposed on top of each other. But we can strip off its layers with the help of modern technology. Before we go to Hissarlik, at Dorpfeld's side, let's not forget what he didn't know about the site and what he knew or could plausibly deduce. Schliemann had established the basic stratification, the levels of the site. Dorpfeld knew that there was a Roman city on the top. There it is with the yellow lines. He knew that there was a Greek city underneath it, Ilion, visited by Alexander the Great. He knew that there was a strange intermediate settlement, which Schliemann had called the 6th city, which they couldn't date precisely. And he knew that deep in the prehistoric layers, there was the city which Schliemann had thought Homer's Troy. But when the two of them had dug together outside this site in 1890, they had discovered a building and part of a fortification wall associated with Mycenaean pottery. In other words, it was this bit, if any, that was connected with the period of the Trojan War. Dorpfeld next put the clues together. Part of a house demolished by Schliemann, fragments of what appeared to be a circuit wall that Schliemann had hit much earlier, and part of a northern circuit wall that Schliemann had demolished 20 years before. Only an architect, perhaps, could have seen that and put them together. But when Dorpfeld did put them together, something like that must have appeared in his mind's eye. The question was, what would there be there, and how much of it would still be standing? In 1893, paid for by Sophie Schliemann and the German Kaiser, Dorpfeld went back to Hissarlik to find out. Under 50 feet of earth and debris and the ruins of later cities, in a great sweep around the south and east of Schliemann's city, Dorpfeld uncovered the tremendous walls of late Bronze Age Troy, including this marvelous angular watchtower, which is now hidden from public view, and which I suppose could have been the great Tower of Ilium itself. It's beautifully built out of dressed limestone blocks, so well done that it almost looks like later classical work. In fact, it helps you to understand why Schliemann demolished things like this when he came across them. It still stands 25 feet high. It must have been at least 30 feet high of limestone, and then above it, a great brick superstructure. So it must have dominated the plain, jutting out like the prow of an old battleship. Out of the soil came beautiful walls, which are shown as they were first seen in Dorpfeld's photographs. Immediately, they seem to recall the city in Homer's Iliad. Homer calls the city well built, and here indeed were walls which made those of Mycenae look crude, even barbaric. Dorpfeld uncovered the bases of what had once been imposing towers, and again Homer describes Troy's fine towers and gates. One of them, the Aegean Gate, flanked by the great tower of Ilios. Dorpfeld found that the defences at Hissarlik had a curious slope, and in the Iliad, Homer says that 3 times the Greek hero Patroclus tried with his bare hands to clamber up the angle of Troy's wall. The place was still small, its 700-yard circuit less than Mycenae, but its fine masonry and elegant architecture showed it had once been the most beautiful fortress in the Aegean. Dorpfeld was elated. The long argument over Troy is over, he wrote. The actual remains of the city of Priam and Hector have come to light. Schliemann has been vindicated. The Trojans have triumphed. Dorpfeld hadn't proved that it was called Troy, but he had proved that there was a late Bronze Age citadel here with Mycenaean contacts in the right place by the mouth of the Dardanelles, with uncanny resemblance to what the bardic tradition enshrined in Homer said. But what was his evidence that it had been destroyed by war? He says, signs of a great fire were evident in many places. The upper parts of the walls and towers had been toppled. The inner buildings had been leveled. Evidently, he said, the city had been destroyed by the hand of an enemy. Durch Feindeshand zerstört. The extent of Dorpfeld's dig on Hissarlik makes him the most important of its excavators. But his great book, Troy and Ilion, was never translated out of German. Indeed, even before it went to press in 1900, the finds which it announced up here by the Dardanelles were to be totally eclipsed by sensational discoveries at the other end of the Aegean Sea in Crete, where a revolution in archaeology was about to take place, single-handedly achieved by an Englishman of genius, Arthur Evans. It was Evans who would destroy Schliemann and Dorpfeld's romantic vision of a Homeric Bronze Age. Evans was born in 1851 into an atmosphere of Victorian industry. A family firm which later provided him with the fortune he spent on archaeology. His father John owned a big paper mill in Hertfordshire, but John Evans was also one of the leading prehistoric scholars of the day, correspondent of Heinrich Schliemann. Not surprisingly, the young Evans grew up fascinated by history and by writing. Unlike the self-taught Schliemann, Evans had a classical education, public school and Oxford. And he returned to Oxford to devote himself to his passion, archaeology. Oxford in the 1880s was a ferment of new ideas about geology and prehistory, provoked by the evolutionary theories of Charles Darwin, a friend of Evans's father. The discovery of new cultures, a byproduct of their imperialism, had seized the late Victorian imagination and helped shape their belief in the evolutionary development from the so-called primitive societies to the higher civilizations. Such ideas formed Evans's view of historical progress long before he went to Greece to try to solve the enigma which had eluded Schliemann. Why had Mycenaean civilization left no trace of writing? The climactic year for Arthur Evans was 1893, the year in which the whole course of his life was determined. It was also a tragic year for him, for his wife died. He was a still youthful 41. But that February, in Athens, Evans was rummaging around in the trays of the antique dealers in the flea market when he came across a number of these, 3- or 4-sided, incised and drilled seal stones. He was told they came from Crete, and with his eye for microscopic detail, he thought he was able to distinguish signs of a hieroglyphic system of writing on them. Now, such systems were known in the cultures of the ancient Near East, like Egypt, but the idea that there might have been writing like this in prehistoric Europe would have seemed far-fetched to most scholars at that time. But the idea had been floated by Heinrich Schliemann, among others, and he and a number of people thought that in Crete they might find the first example of the adoption of writing in the West. And so it was to Crete that Evans turned to find his answers. And there, one can only say, destiny awaited him. Crete was steeped in legend. Here had been the seat of King Minos, who had ruled the Aegean with his navy long before the Trojan War. It was the site of the labyrinth, lair of a monstrous half-man, half-bull, the Minotaur. Here the architect Daedalus had fashioned the wings with which Icarus had escaped from Crete, only to fly too near the sun. From here, according to Homer, King Idomeneus sailed to Troy with his 80 black ships. Evans first arrived in Crete in March 1894, feeling considerably the worse for a bad 24-hour voyage from Piraeus, he wrote in his diary. He had come, he said grandly, to find the origin of Greek civilization, and with it the origin of all great culture that has ever been. Crete is a continent in miniature, poised like a stepping stone between Europe, the Near East, and Africa. Its people are descended from prehistoric folk, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, and Turks, and all have left their mark on the landscape and on the faces of the island. But where would Evans's search for writing lead now? Throwing off his seasickness, on his very first day, he wandered around the market in Heraklion. There he found more seal stones. A clue was in my hands, he wrote, and I resolved to follow it, if possible to the innermost recesses of the labyrinth itself. For the seal stones had indeed come from the site of the legendary labyrinth, a then insignificant hill now known to the world as Knossos. The paths of history and myth had begun to converge.
Knossos, please.
The hill Evans saw was very different from the one we see today. For after his excavation, Evans decided to partially reconstruct the palace. To an extent, what there is now is his.
You can imagine that this is happening in 2,000 years before Christ.
But what did he see when he first put spade to soil in March 1900? His finds were nothing less than a revelation. Only inches below the surface, he found a throne room 3,500 years old. It was in an unbelievable state of preservation, fragments of paintings still hanging on the walls. In the storerooms, rows of jars still contained grain, dried beans, and lentils. That spring, it was obvious to Evans what the palace was. It was, of course, Mycenaean. A Cretan palace which had been conquered by Mycenaean mainlanders and finally destroyed around 1200 BC. The interpretation and the date fitted Homer's picture of a Greek king, Idomeneus, on the throne of Knossos at the time of the Trojan War. The palace closely resembled those in mainland Greece, paintings like those at Tiryns. Stone rosettes like those on the treasury of Atreus at Mycenae. Above all, stirrup jars, as Evans wrote, the most common form of Mycenaean pottery. But who were these so-called Mycenaeans? The answer clearly lay in Evans' key find. Only days into the dig, he had turned up strange baked clay tablets. They were inscribed with an unknown system of writing. Confident that he would soon decipher their script, Evans persuaded the Oxford University Press to cast a type fount for his new language. He was convinced that he had found the missing link between the cultures of the Near East and of early Greece, one of the great languages of the ancient world. Like his other finds, he called it Mycenaean. But within months, he completely changed his mind. It was not Mycenaean, but Minoan. Evans took the name from the legendary King Minos, and Minos came to stand for the Minoan culture which Evans thought had ruled mainland Greece, including Schliemann's Mycenae. The bull of Minos had replaced the mask of Agamemnon as the symbol of the Aegean Bronze Age. The palace of Minos, Evans thought, had been the center of an empire which had dominated the Aegean with its navy, just as the legend had it. Its people were sophisticated, controlled, but fun-loving. Devotees of outdoor sports like the strange bull leaping depicted on the frescoes. For Evans, the Minoans were lovers of the natural world, their rituals and festivals presenting the image of a lost golden age. Presided over by their bull-masked king, who issued Europe's first law code from the throne of the Palace of Minos. Evans came to identify intensely with that vision. Perhaps that was why he felt impelled to reconstruct the palace, literally to make the vision concrete. I'm sure most people who come to Knossos must at some point wonder about these reconstructions of Sir Arthur Evans and about the psychology behind them. Did he do it for the general public, or did he do it to gratify some inner need to make it all more tangible? When you compare him with Heinrich Schliemann, Schliemann's driving obsession, his inner demon, is so near to the surface, so naive. With Evans, it seems different. But I think Evans was just as much a man of his time. And it was a troubled time, the 1890s and the early years of the 20th century. A lot of creative people were dismayed by what they saw as a rising tide of industrialism and imperialism. And it wasn't just artists like Paul Gauguin rushing off to Tahiti to find the lost innocence of the world. It was intellectuals too, like H.G. Wells. And I think that Arthur Evans found his lost innocence here. His sister said that he was a romantic who needed to escape from the present, and that he found this new civilization which was so wonderfully to his taste, and here at Knossos he was able to create a world in which his mind and his eye could dwell, a world in which he could escape the painfulness of the present, where he found no peace. So there was no room for Homer in Evans's view of the Aegean Bronze Age. It was the benevolent imperialists from Knossos who were the history makers, the new Victorians. Across the Aegean in the 15th century BC, King Minos ruled the waves, master and civilizer of what Schliemann had thought Homeric Greece. The valleys of Mycenae were farmed by Cretan colonists, nabobs in a Minoan Raj. The great building achievements of the mainland, like the treasury of Atreus at Mycenae, were the work of Cretans, perhaps even of the architect of Knossos, great Daedalus himself. After the fall of Knossos in around 1400 BC, Evans thought Mycenae was left a decadent backwater. From here, no imperial expedition could ever have set sail. The Trojan War was a mere fairy tale. In the academic world, Evans's ideas became the establishment view. He himself appeared a stern figure who brooked no argument. But his godson, James Candy, who lived with him before the First War at Boar's Hill near Oxford, knew a different side of the great man.
Now then, this is the place, and by Jove, you're going to see a view here. Wait till we get up to these doors, and then I'm going to just push it open, and you go straight in. Now then, look at that. Isn't that lovely?
It's wonderful. What an
I should come here and giggle.
extraordinary place. Here, Evans built an artificial lake and a house to share with his wife. Her early death shattered that hope, but when not in Knossos, the childless Evans retreated to this private world. The house, Yulebury, with its Minoan fantasies, is gone now, though the gardens Evans planted remain. Here, the boy Candy knew him in a way his fellow scholars never did.
So
he grew his little finger
all
long.
the others were perfectly all right. That one was his personal excavator. Because, you see, he'd look at things, as he was my cockpit, he'd look at things and he'd bear coins or pottery. He would...
Marvellous.
Marvellous.
What sort of man was he? I'm almost wondering whether he was a bit of a romantic, although when you read his academic work, he comes over as very severe.
There are two sides to him, you see. In fact, his contemporaries, when they came down and to stay here, saw Sir Arthur. He said, this is not Sir Arthur I know at Knossos or at the Athenaeum or at the British Museum or the Ashmolean.
Because he frightened them, didn't he?
Frightened them
He
to
had a
death.
reputation of being a real tyrant.
Oh, yes. Very autocratic.
So are you saying that he really shared his real thoughts with you?
Yes, he was happy when he was with children. He loved playing charades and dressing up because he had all beautiful collection of Balkan shawls and covers and so on, all hand done on his sofas and that sort of thing. And all the boys had yellow little ribbons put on, and the girls had blue. And you had to match up with them, you see. And then you danced them, but he would lead the little girl onto the floor of the hall. And it went rather like a labyrinth, all the way around, so you had to follow it. But in time, you came to the middle, and there would Sir Arthur be, on top of the Minotaur. And of course, these children would come up, you know, and he'd go, like that, and throw the child up in the air and catch it, put it down, next one. You see, make a noise of a bull. And that went on till, well, there was about 20 or 30 children, you see. And of course, one or two, oh no, I don't like the bull. The others, of course, they thought that was absolutely marvellous.
Did he talk to you about his wonderful Cretan discoveries? Did he try to help you imagine what he'd found, what the Minoans were like? And did he see them as real people?
Oh, yes.
How did he paint it to you?
He is real people. And in a simplified form. He didn't say this was a certain 2000 BC and all that, all the technical side. He brought them alive to you. I mean, his description of lying in the Villa Ariadne when the big earthquake, when everybody was screaming and shouting and rushing around, he lay there and he was most intrigued because under the bed, the great rumblings. Because he said in the letter to me, he said it was the bull bellowing.
Wonderful.
Yeah. That's what fascinated me, and it still fascinates me to this day, that he was two people.
Evans stood over the field for 50 years, like a giant. His definitive publication, The Palace of Minos, is perhaps the greatest work of archaeological scholarship ever written, and no man has ever dominated a field like he did. But major problems remained unresolved, and chief among them was the writing, the very thing which had led Evans to Knossos in the first place. He'd put his thoughts down on paper in 1909 in Scripta Minoa, but the mysterious tablet, the Minoan writing, as he called it, Linear B, still remained untranslated. The one thing they could not be, he asserted time and again, was Greek. But there were opponents who disagreed, who felt that Mycenae had always been independent of Crete, and that in its heyday in the 13th century, it had ruled the Aegean and headed a confederacy which could indeed have attacked Troy. Chief among the opponents was an American, Carl Blegen. And with the young and confident Americans, Aegean archaeology enters the age of film. After the authoritarian Germans and the old-school Britons, the new world would now bring a fresh and more scientific eye to the old world's greatest story. And coming out of the Depression, it must have seemed a swell party. Blegen was born in 1886 and trained as an archaeologist when Evans was at the height of his influence. A quiet Midwesterner, he evolved his own ideas about Evans' Minoan theory. Looking at the same evidence as Evans, Blegen saw something very different. Finds of pottery from mainland Greece all over the eastern Mediterranean suggested to him that the backwater of Mycenae had actually dominated the Aegean in the 14th and 13th centuries. Evans's Age of Decadence. Blegen found a friend and an ally in an English scholar, Alan Wace. By 1930, the two had a system of Mycenaean pottery which could give accurate dates. They were sure now that Homer's picture of an imperial Mycenae was basically right. And that, of course, led them back to Troy itself. Was the story true? Was Hissarlik really Troy? Athens, 9th of July 1931. Dear Gov, Blegen wrote to Wace, Troy is a splendid site, and one could still do a good bit of digging there. I wish we could get up an expedition to dig there. I could easily raise the money if there were any prospect of wangling the permit, but I don't think there's any chance of that. But in 1932, with Dorpfeld's help, Blegen's chance came to dig areas left untouched by the Germans 40 years before. The searchers were again on Homer's trail. And so, as Hitler was poised to come to power in Germany, the third great exploration of Hissarlik began. Blegen filmed it, one of the first digs to be so recorded. He re-examined all 9 levels of the hill, stretching long before and long after the time of the Trojan War. It turned out to be nothing less than a cross-section of human history. But Homer was never far from Blegen's thoughts. Had Dorpfeld's city of the fine angled walls really witnessed the events of the Iliad? Now there came yet another twist to this already extraordinary story. Blegen decided that the heaped walls of Dorpfeld's city had not been toppled by Agamemnon's army, but by a tremendous natural catastrophe. An earthquake. To understand where that left Homer's tale, we need to look at what he found in the layer above the earthquake, the city built on the debris of Dorpfeld's Troy. Blegen excavated in 4 main areas. Here, around the east gate, on the north, where he uncovered part of the circuit wall demolished by Schliemann. On the west, he found the footings of an immense bastion, which went down 23 feet below ground level, forming a counterpoint to the bastion uncovered by Dorpfeld on the other side of the city. And here, by the south gate, Blegen found the foundations of a beautiful colonnaded house, which he called the Pillar House, 30 yards long, with the remains of the main street going up past it. This great city, however, Blegen decided had been destroyed by an earthquake. End of the line for Homer's story? Well, not quite. Blegen's attention focused on the successor city, Troy 7a, where a remarkable change had come over the character of the whole settlement. These grand houses, with the wide spaces between them, seemed to have been superseded by a network of tenements, immediately obvious to the eye. What had happened? After the earthquake, the survivors on Hissarlik had cleared the debris and rebuilt where they could. But all over the hill, Blegen detected signs that all was not well. When you walked inside the main gate and up the main street, you saw the evidence immediately. In here, the Americans found 3 not particularly well-built rooms, of which this, the largest, was some sort of bakery. They found grinders for pounding the grain into flour. They found fireplaces, sort of improvised ovens for baking the bread. And in that corner, a series of bins made out of wood and brick for the storage of a large number of loaves, such as you can see in any bakery in the Mediterranean today. Now, Carl Blegen also thought that liquid was stored and dispensed here, and he pointed to this, which he thought was the slop tray with a drain out into the street. Now, it being a bakery, you would expect that a lot of surplus water would have to be got rid of, but Carl Blegen thought that it was wine, and that wine was dispensed here. And the interpretation he gave to the whole suite of buildings was that the bread and the wine and other stores were sold in that little kiosk straight onto the street, sold to thirsty and harassed heroes as they staggered back, shell-shocked as it were, after a hard day's fighting in the Trojan plain. Now, in considering that marvelously vivid image, you must remember that it is the product of an archaeologist working in the middle years of this century. The model, of course, is the soup kitchens of the beleaguered cities of Europe in the Second World War, a suitably contemporary image for this 20th century version of the tale of Troy.
For that is what Blegen thought he had found. A Troy which had suffered two catastrophes, the first by an earthquake, the second soon after by the hand of man. Everything seemed to fit. At its height, before the earthquake, the city had 24 fine houses widely spaced. Now those spaces were blocked with shanties, gloomy little bungalows, one-roomed and partitioned prefabs squashed together.
The underfloors of the houses were honeycombed with sunken storage jars, covered with flagstones to keep grain, beans, smoked meat. The normally taciturn Blegen was prepared to talk of a war economy, rations, dare we say it? Well, he did, a siege mentality. It was as if those last carefree summers before the Second War, the sharpness of the light, the gaiety, the gentle horseplay, had found an unconscious response in the tale, in the last calm before Troy was attacked. A dream of calm, the poet Aeschylus said, which came to Troy with the delicate adornment of riches, desire that stings the heart. Smoke marks even now the conquered city. Whirlwinds of doom are still alive. The embers dying with the city send forth rich gusts of wealth. Methinks I hear the cries of the vanquished, people thrown down on the bodies of husbands and brothers, children lying in their aged parents' arms, voices no longer free, bewailing the deaths of their loved ones. We executed payment for their presumptuous robbery. They raped our queen, we raped their city, and we were right. The city was destroyed by fire, possibly within even a generation of being rebuilt. Down in the street there, the debris was as much as 5 feet thick, of charred wood, bricks, rubble, and ashes. In the entrance to the snack bar were fragments of a human skull, perhaps the proprietor himself, and nearby the remains of 2 skeletons, covered by masses of rubble which had showered down on them from the houses lining the street. And here in this western alley, near part of a human jawbone, was found this arrowhead, which Carl Blegen identified as being of a Mediterranean type. He thought that it had been fired by one of the Greek attackers. And outside, below the wall, lay unburied a skeleton, perhaps of one of those Greek attackers, whose head had been crushed by a terrible blow. For the city had certainly this time not been destroyed by earthquake, but by an invading army which had ruthlessly sacked and burned it before departing. The circumstances fitted Homer's story perfectly. The date, Blegen thought, was smack on, about 1240 BC. So for him, there was no longer any doubt. The siege of Troy was a fact.
Imagination is a very important quality for an archaeologist to possess. But did one arrowhead make a war? Did sunken storage jars and a soup kitchen prove a siege? Could this huddle of shanties really have been Homer's city? Still looking for answers, I turned to a man who had actually dug with Blegen at Troy. In Athens, I voiced my doubts to Jerome Sperling. Can any archaeologist dig at Hissarlik with a mind free of Homer? Had Blegen, like Schliemann and Dorpfeld before him, gone there to find what he wanted to find? Jerome's reply was strangely ambiguous.
To me, it doesn't have any great significance, this criticism, because everybody's Troy is different from everybody else's Troy. It depends upon what blend you make of the poetry you have read, or the how much you know of the archaeology and care about it, and how you use your own imagination. The placing of those great storage jars under the floors of the houses of 7A in that passage that was newly filled with these buildings, that doesn't mean that the Trojans knew there was going to be a great expedition against them, or that they foresaw Agamemnon's coming with such an expedition. But it means, in very simple terms, that they didn't want to have their country places raided so that they would lose their annual crops. I would take it to be as simple as that.
But didn't you ever stand on that dig and look at the skeleton you found in the ditch and the snack bar behind the gate and the destruction level? And didn't you ever think it was a Greek expedition that did this, just as Homer said?
I wouldn't say yes or no. I don't see the need for identifying Agamemnon, you see, as being the person there at the end of Troy 7A. I mean, I'm overpowered by Homeric poetry, and I think everyone is who reads it carefully. It's an overpowering experience, but that doesn't make it doesn't have to make it historical, because you see, poetic truth comes in the people that he talks about, and their hopes and despair and problems and conflict. That's where the truth of it is.
But in archaeology, truth depends on interpretation. Blegen, however, never had any doubts that the plundered and ravaged mound of Hissarlik had finally given up its secrets. And if the events of the Iliad were true, then it only confirmed the idea that Mycenae was at its height in the 13th century BC, contrary to Evans's whole view of the late Bronze Age. The solution to the impasse Blegen knew must lie in the Linear B tablets. To Evans's great disappointment, decipherment of his so-called Minoan language had proved impossible. All over the world, scholars were fascinated by the problem, but Evans had published too small a sample to give them a real chance of solving it. Blegen decided to look for a mainland archive, an unexcavated palace. He headed for the western Peloponnese, for sandy Pylos. Somewhere on that lovely coast, Homer says,
was the palace of Agamemnon's ally, King Nestor. Locals led Blegen to a hill called Arno Englianos, high above the sea. There, on the very first morning, he found his archive. Clay tablets, hundreds of them, in the same Linear B script as Evans had found at Knossos. The palace Blegen uncovered had been untouched since 1200 BC. Again, we have his record on film. In the royal hall, the central circular hearth was intact, where a king had feasted at the time of the Trojan War. The storerooms were packed with the shattered wealth of the heroic age. The palace was evidently of the same culture as Evans's palace at Knossos, and the tablets proved it was. But in what language were they written? The mystery of the Mycenaeans was nearing its solution. It was now possible, at last, to publish a mass of Linear B texts. This paved the way for the decipherment. In the summer of 1952, an almost nonchalant radio broadcast announced what would soon be billed as the Everest of archaeology. It was made by a gifted English amateur, the 33-year-old architect Michael Ventris.
This is the BBC Home Service.
During the last few weeks, I've suddenly come to the conclusion that the Knossos and Pylos tablets must, after all, be written in Greek, a difficult and archaic Greek, seeing that it's 500 years older than Homer, and written in a rather abbreviated form, but Greek nevertheless.
For Carl Blegen, the decipherment of Linear B must have been the crowning moment of his career. For Arthur Evans, it would have been a traumatic revelation, but the old man had died in 1941, 90 years old, and never learned the truth about his palace of Minos. James Candy remembers those last days.
I was married, and up to me I was in work, but the times I'd come up here on my own, and I'd look into the big drawing room. There he was, sitting in his chair with a rug over him, and the black cat sitting there beside him.
On his own?
On his own,
Yeah.
entirely on his own.
Do you think that Knossos not broke him, but it must have been a fantastic expenditure, both in money and energy, over such a long time? Do you think in the end that it exhausted him?
It did, and financially.
Really?
Oh, yes.
Really?
Yes.
So are you saying by the end he couldn't really afford to keep up this wonderful...
As he said to me that one evening, he said, "I ought not to be living here, Jimmy." I said, "Why not, Sir Arthur?" He said, "You know, I've spent all my money on Knossos." And so he had.
So Evans's ancient Minoan civilization, which had so enriched the culture of early Greece, had indeed been conquered by the mainland Mycenaeans. Knossos had been ruled by the bronze-clad Greeks. Homer had been vindicated. We began this stage of our search with the quest for writing. Heinrich Schliemann and Arthur Evans both found it impossible to believe that the heroic world that they had uncovered was illiterate. Arthur Evans found the writing, but died before it was revealed that it was Greek, and that a Greek king had sat here on the throne of Minos at Knossos. Had Heinrich Schliemann known that, I'm sure he would have seen it as the final vindication of his faith in Homer's version of the Bronze Age and of the Trojan War. And indeed, the decipherment of Linear B has led to a whole series of new questions about Homer. And those are the questions we can no longer put off in our search. Who was Homer? Does his story go back to real events? And is it possible that it was transmitted orally over 500 years after the destruction of these great palaces? Those are the questions we'll turn to next week.